So I'll just be going over EDPAs, the review itself that we've been working on, why we're doing it and what the goal is, the shared values and objectives, and then wrap things up by going over the next steps. So to provide a very brief overview of EDPAs for those who may not be so familiar, for others who I've had conversations with in the past, my apologies. I know it's probably burned into your brain by now. But they're areas that require special treatment or consideration when development activity, which includes vegetation removal and land alteration, takes place. So along Kootenay Lake, really they're seeking to preserve the riparian area along the shoreline. And they're guided by specific objectives that we're trying to achieve for the areas that they apply to. And then for those areas, we use specific guidelines for development to help achieve those objectives that have been identified. So the map here shows where EDPAs exist along Kootenay Lake shoreline. So in electoral areas A and E, these are the areas within 15 meters of the natural boundary of a watercourse like Kootenay Lake. In area D, it's within 30 meters of the natural boundary or high watermark. And then in area F, there's currently no DPA in place. And just one last note on this slide, you'll also notice that the language refers to a watercourse, which essentially means a body of water. So while our focus today is on Kootenay Lake, these development permit areas also apply to creeks, rivers, springs, wetlands, as well as certain ravines. Just having some technical difficulties with the slide here. There we go. So what exactly does this mean if someone is looking to work in an EDPA or has an EDPA on their property? Well, at a practical level, really it means that a permit is required prior to any new development taking place, unless that activity is exempt from requiring a development permit. And I say new because already developed sites don't require a permit unless some sort of new activity is being proposed that would disturb the riparian area. And in order to get a permit, there are things that need to happen. So first, an application needs to be submitted to the RDCK with a riparian assessment report from a qualified environmental professional. And really the bulk of the application kind of lives in this report. Next, and it's kind of, I should have probably flipped this, but it's better to do this at the front end of any project, is to ensure that the proposal substantially meets the guidelines of the EDPA. So figuring that out is, the easiest way to do that is probably just to give the RDCK planning department a call and discuss what it is you're looking to accomplish there, or what you want to do with your property to determine A, if a permit's required, and B, if you substantially meet the guidelines with what you're looking to do. And I think it's really important to clarify here that a development permit cannot be denied necessarily where the guidelines are substantially met. So another way of thinking about this is a decision on whether or not to issue a permit will never be, no, you can't have the permit, but it might be not yet, we can't issue it. The guidelines need to be better met by the proposal. So once an application has been received and it meets the guidelines, a development permit can be issued and the property owner must comply with the conditions of that permit. So essentially how they said they'd complete the work in their application is the expectation for how it will actually be completed. And as I mentioned in the previous slide, this is a process that already applies in electoral areas A, D, and E. And I should also mention just quickly before we move on, that a building permit cannot be issued until a development permit is first issued. So you can still apply for a building permit in order to not delay a project, but the development permit needs to be there first before any work starts. So why exactly are we doing this review? And I think that this will kind of tie back into the relevance of Carrie and Kenton's presentation as well. There are a number of reasons for doing this review, and I think what probably highlights the importance of it the most is the results of the most recent inventory work on Kootenay Lake, which is on the slide, it's referred to as the FIMP. So the most recent one was completed in 2021, and it shows us the changes that have taken place between 2012 and 2021, the 2 years that Kootenay Lake was inventoried most recently. And I'll just say that there are tons of important nuggets of information in this document, which there's also a link to on our website. But I think the ones that are most relevant for this project are that 4.5 kilometers of natural shoreline has been disturbed or altered over that 9-year period, and that habitat degradation is taking place over time. And in response to these changes we're seeing along Kootenay Lake, really there are 2 practical options that stand out. First, the RDCK could maintain the status quo. So thinking back to that map that I showed before, just keep that approach in place. In doing so, there's a potential risk that the province could step in and say, hey, you're really not doing a good enough job protecting habitat along the lake, so we're going to explore intervention. And this is something that happened in the early 2000s in the Okanagan, Columbia Shuswap, Thompson-Nicola, the Lower Mainland, and the island because of the development pressure that was being experienced there. So that's not to say that that's something that will happen, but it's, certainly potential. There's potential for it in the future. Unfortunately, I don't have a crystal ball to say whether or not that would be the case. The other option is to better address the loss of habitat. So if we can do that, then there's really the greatest chance possible of keeping decision-making for property development at the local level, which has its benefits. So our goal with this review of the Kootenay Lake EDPAs is kind of twofold. First, to provide greater clarity in the guidelines themselves and the exemptions to make them more user-friendly. And next, to make the EDPAs along Kootenay Lake more consistent and align them with best management practices and resident values. So we're better preserving, that important riparian habitat as well as those important Ktunaxa cultural values along Kootenay Lake. So thinking of best management practices that are mentioned there, and linking this back to Carrie and Kenton's presentation, that document that we keep referencing, the shoreline guidance document, is essentially just that, best management practices. It's a framework for decision-making that respects Ktunaxa cultural and archaeological values, as well as environmental values. So a big piece of this review is figuring out how we can best incorporate that into the development permit areas on top of incorporating resident values. So how exactly are we going to achieve these goals? And I won't go through this slide in great detail here, but I'll just say that what we wanted to do was, take a ground up approach. So in this first phase here, shown on the slide, we started by getting a sense of the issues associated with the current EDPAs. So both within the organization, within the RDCK, and some of the concerns and challenges of other organizations through that Kootenay Lake partnership. And really that was the key focus of that first phase. Figure out, okay, if we're going to do a review of this, let's get an understanding of the issues and challenges here. Next, we really wanted to focus our efforts on education to build riparian area awareness and an understanding of EDPAs. And that's something that's ongoing, that's continuing all the time. And, from that, just kind of the key piece here of the second phase was identifying values that we share for Kootenay Lake, which sort of cover it in greater detail. And next is the third options analysis phase, where really, we've heard all of these great individual values for Kootenay Lake, and we're starting to see a bit of overlap with some common themes there and thinking, looking towards, how can we integrate these into the EDPAs? And that's the space that we're in right now with the project. So making sure that the objectives that we've drafted accurately reflect the commonly shared values for Kootenay Lake. And this slide kind of lays out the engagement process associated with the EDPA review. So we started with identifying those shared values for Kootenay Lake. And that also ties into the values that Carrie went over in her presentation. So the cultural and archaeological values, those are also being considered in this as well in the final sort of implementation. And then next, we created draft EDPA objectives to represent the most commonly touched on themes in that, that values identification phase. So we got feedback on those objectives as well as some potential directions those could lead to for development guidelines and exemptions from 2 focus groups that we held. And we've refined them into objectives on the next slide. And then this third feedback box is kind of where we're at right now with this over the next month. So getting feedback from stakeholders, local Indigenous groups, the public, development community, really anyone who wants to provide their feedback. And then once we have that, we'll move to this next sort of stage in the process. So creating the draft EDPA. And this, you know, once we have that drafted, there'll be a decision on whether or not to draft amending bylaws for the board to consider. And once those get put together, they would go through the public hearing process, which would then be another opportunity for public input. And then finally, considering all of this feedback and all of the technical analysis and research that's gone into it, the RDCK board makes a decision on whether or not to adopt the changes. So that kind of brings me to the crux of the presentation here. The key themes that were identified are listed on the left side of the table here. They're summarized as the natural environment, fish and wildlife habitat, water quality, and human interaction with riparian areas. And the objectives that are associated with each are listed in the right side of the table. So when it comes to these values and objectives, the most valuable piece of information to know from the RDCK's perspective is how well do they represent your individual values for Kootenay Lake? Are there any big ones missing here? And really, this is what the remainder of the engagement for this project focuses on, because the better those values are represented in the objectives, the more relevant the guidelines for development become. And for the sake of time, I won't read through all of these as much as I want to, but I'll just mention again that there's a feedback form, again, that's on our website, where you can take a closer look at these and let us know what you think. So the feedback form also contains information on what guidelines and exemptions could be focused on to give a better sense of what the expectations for development along the shoreline actually are. So the public consultation period for this kind of next phase of engagement here is from now until December 1st. Those feedback forms are the main way to provide that detailed feedback to us. And to make this as accessible as we can for the project, I will also be available from Tuesdays to Thursdays from 1 to 3 p.m. In our Lakeside Drive office in Nelson until December 1st. And, you know, during that 2-hour time period, I won't slot any meetings. I won't do anything. All I will do is focus on providing feedback to those who reach out, either, you know, come into the office or over the phone, email, online, whatever it is. The point being, we want to try and make this as accessible as we can to help get that feedback. And then after December 1st, we'll start to compile all the feedback that we've received, refine an EDPA approach for Kootenay Lake, and bring forward a recommendation to the RDCK Board of Directors on whether to proceed with changes. So here we have a link to the project page, but I pasted that in the chat earlier. And then my contact information is on the right side as well, which will also paste in the chat before leaving today. So I guess with that, I'll stop the recording and we can jump into some Q&A.